Good morning. Bon matin. Et merci d'être avec
Good
nous.
morning, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Tyler McCann, Managing Director at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before starting our conversation today, it's important for me to recognize that I come from Western Quebec, from the traditional non-ceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquian people. The recognition and the reflection on the history of First Nations, including their presence on the agricultural lands from sea to sea to sea, is essential on the road to reconciliation, a road we must all continue to walk on together.
Environmental initiative. Spearheading solutions. Helping policies that help farmers operate better, smarter, and more environmentally sustainably. Funded in part by the RBC Foundation. The support from partners like the RBC Foundation is essential to the future of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Please reach out if you are interested in working together to advance policy solutions that meet the growing needs of consumers in Canada and around the world through a more resilient, sustainable, productive, competitive, and profitable agri-food system. Our Spearheading Solutions initiative aims to explore how we can leverage public and private policies to aid in the rapid adoption of beneficial management practices and increase the implementation of new tools and technologies to maximize environmental and social outcomes. Improving environmental outcomes is essential to improving the overall outcomes of Canadian agriculture and food. On-farm action is an important component of delivering the sustainable productivity growth that Canada and the world need agriculture and food producers to deliver. Sustainability is incredibly important, but it must come with productivity growth. Earlier this year, CAPI hosted a webinar with our distinguished fellow, Susan Woodbone, and our doctoral fellow, Mary-Elise Sampson, that explored the opportunities and challenges that exist with using complex biological systems to increase sustainability, reduce emissions, and increase mitigation. The work Susan and Mary-Elise and others have done highlights the need for solutions that reflect the realities of an individual farm or field. Please visit CAPI's YouTube page to watch the webinar and read Susan's recently released report to find out more. Les plans environnementaux en agriculture.
The environmental plans in agriculture can offer solutions to the farm that reflect the diversity of agricultural enterprises in Canada. Now, the program EFP can help with an approach that connects the needs and the expectations to improve environmental results with the need to have unique solutions in farms when all this is implemented. At the moment where governments negotiate the next strategic framework for agriculture, the moment has arrived to reflect on the future of environmental farm plans.
Open today's dialogue.
Hi, everyone. On behalf of RBC and RBC's Foundation Tech for Nature, thanks for joining the webinar today. Tech for Nature is our global multi-year commitment from the RBC Foundation to support new ideas, technologies, and partnerships to address our most complex environmental challenges. Today, we're talking about policy, but ultimately we'll need those new ideas and technologies to help make Canada's farms as sustainable as possible. As Tyler mentioned, I'm Colin Goldman, an economist with RBC's Thought Leadership and Economics team, and I'm focused on energy transition and climate change. At RBC and in our team, we view agriculture as a critical economic sector. It accounts for 5% of our exports, and it's one where the challenges and opportunities posed by climate change and climate action need to be a key focus. Farmers have made strides to reduce their climate impact, and the energy intensity of agricultural production has fallen. But as the global population grows, exporting countries like Canada will find many more mouths to feed. Without greater climate action on their part, more meals means more emissions. Getting it wrong or failing to put enough public support behind our farmers means higher costs, something Canadians are already struggling with as record-breaking inflation pressures prices at grocers and restaurants across the country. The good news is options exist. Our flagship report, the $2 trillion transition, released last fall, outlined the potential for regenerative agriculture, the 4 Rs, and better manure management to help Canada cut emissions by as much as 31 million tons. When we wrote it, we noted how challenging it is to cut emissions in the sector. The first step is, of course, measuring and understanding farm emissions and the potential of agricultural soils to store carbon, work I'm happy we're here to discuss today. With that, I'll welcome you once again on behalf of the RBC Foundation and look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you, Colin. And again, thank you to the RBC Foundation for its support of this project. The challenges that you outlined are significant, but the opportunities for agriculture to play an incredibly important role are enormous. Cappy was pleased to work with Wilton Consulting and Bronwynne and her team in this project. I'd like to now pass things over to Bronwynne, who led the research project to facilitate today's discussion. Welcome, Bronwynne.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler. My name is Bronwynne Wilton, and I am the principal and lead consultant at Wilton Consulting Group based here in Fergus, Ontario. And our team focuses on facilitating sustainability and innovation in agri-food and rural systems through a change management approach. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Cappy for the opportunity to not only work on this project, but also to host this webinar today. And thank you to everyone who's joined us from across Canada today. I'm looking forward to a really great discussion. And before we begin today's session, I would like to begin by acknowledging that our work in this sector is inherently tied to the land and the geographical region where we live, work, and play. And as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all of the generations of people who have stewarded this land for thousands of years. As I am joining this workshop today from Fergus, Ontario, I acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Fergus is located on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. And today, many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people continue to live and work in Wellington County. And we recognize that this land acknowledgement is but a very small but an important first step towards truth, reconciliation, and a respectful collaborative path forward. And on that note, I would be pleased to share with you the research findings in the report that will be released soon. It's not currently available, but it will be very shortly, on achieving balance, the future of the environmental farm plan in Canada. And I am going to just bear with me for 10 seconds while I share my screen. Great. Super. So as I mentioned, I just want to share a high-level overview of the report we worked on for Cappy over the past few months. And then we're going to move, after my presentation, we'll have a brief moment for a couple questions, Q&A from the audience, but then we'll be turning our attention. We have a really great panel lined up to share some thoughts and insights on the EFP, both current and future ideas and insights. So we'll be moving along fairly quickly through this presentation so that we can bring our panelists on so we can open it up to a great conversation. So the scope and purpose of our project was to gain a better understanding of the role and importance of the Environmental Farm Plan, or EFP, in Canada within the evolving landscape of sustainability standards. And those would be the market-driven types of sustainability standards that we're seeing across the sector. The policy paper aims to provide agricultural stakeholders with insights for future EFP programming across Canada, and also to inform consultations on the next agricultural policy framework, a 5-year federal, provincial, territorial investment in the Canadian agriculture and agri-food sector. For those of you who may not be familiar with the EFP, it is a voluntary educational tool for assessing environmental risks on the farm. Farmers across Canada work with either their provincial or territorial ministry staff or staff at agricultural organizations to complete their environmental farm plans for their own farm operation. The goals of the EFP are to facilitate environmental knowledge sharing and continuous improvement with best beneficial management practices at the farm level. It's also to support farmers in producing safe, nutritious products while minimizing their environmental risks and impacts. EFP programming is currently available in all 10 provinces plus Yukon, and I understand Northwest Territories is starting their EFP program as well. And the history of the EFP program stretches back to the early 1990s. So it's quite a long-standing program across in some provinces and more recent in others. In 2017, Statistics Canada estimated that approximately 40% of Canada's farms have a completed environmental farm plan. And we'll see what those numbers look like with the coming release of new statistics, and the uptake of the EFP program does vary by farm type and by province. We see particularly strong uptake within dairy, poultry, and pork sectors typically, but there is variability across the country and across sectors. The current funding context of the Environmental Farm Plan program in Canada has historically been funded through a collaboration between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, the FPT. And today, the programs are funded through FPT under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which ends on March 31st, 2023. Consultations are currently underway on the next Agricultural Policy Framework, or NPF, spanning from 2023 to 2028. And as some context for our discussion today, we are including the Guelph Statement, which was from the early meeting of the NPF in November of 2021 in Guelph, hence the name of the statement, identifying the priorities, guiding principles, and focus areas of the NPF. I've just pulled this quote out. There's a little bit more in terms of guiding principles and objectives of the Guelph Statement. However, this I think is important context for us to think about as where the EFP fits into the next policy framework as we move forward. So it states that Canada is recognized as a world leader in sustainable agriculture and agri-food production and drives forward to 2028 from a solid foundation of regional strengths and diversity, as well as the strong leadership of the provinces and territories in order to rise to the climate change challenge, to expand new markets and trade while meeting the expectations of consumers, and to feed Canadians and a growing global population. So with that in mind, what did we do to inform this paper? In addition to desk research, we also conducted 33 key informant interviews with staff at EFP delivery organizations, staff with provincial and territorial agricultural ministries, as well as representatives of commodity organizations. We also hosted a virtual workshop with some of the same staff and people, but some others joined us as well for that workshop. And there we brainstormed impacts of the EFP program, barriers and solutions to EFP delivery and oversight, and key information for policymakers. And what did we learn through this process? Well, I learned quite a bit, and it was a really great process to be part of. And we spoke to a lot of really dedicated people involved with the EFP throughout the country. So one of the main things we heard over and over again was the importance of the EFP as an educational tool for farmers to learn about agri-environmental issues. And that came out loud and clear through the engagement process. As an example, there's a quote there from one of the Provincial Agricultural Ministry representatives that there shouldn't be any question if there will be an EFP program under the next policy framework. The EFP is fundamental to the work we do across Canada and is absolutely a foundational piece. So that gives you a flavor of the commitment and passion for the EFP program across the delivery staff and personnel. And what came up as part of that too was that the EFP program is such a staple that in fact many individuals involved in its delivery and oversight would like to see the program become core funded. So in addition, a kind of a nuanced difference to the fact that people are very passionate and committed to the EFP as an educational tool, there was widespread recognition that the EFP program is in a state of evolution or transition. There are a number of words like that used in our interviews with various people. And that transition is happening in three main ways. So one, at the delivery of how the EFP is delivered in the provinces and territories, and coverage and focus, so the content and what's in the EFP is in a state of transition. And then of course the staff complement that makes up the actual oversight and delivery of the program. So just to dig into that a little bit deeper, in terms of the delivery of the EFP program in general has always been flexible to change based on provincial and territorial needs. So you'll see across the provinces that there's different ways that it's delivered, sometimes with an arm's length organization like Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association in Ontario, or Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture in Nova Scotia. And sometimes it's delivered by the provinces themselves, with provincial staff being more involved. So there's that variability across the provinces and territories for what makes sense from that province's perspective. One of the big trends we see, and I'm sure it's no surprise, especially the past 2 years we've all been living through, is that transition to a mostly virtual experience is a key trend. So an online delivery of an educational tool. And with that, of course, comes some efficiencies, but also the concerns that perhaps we're losing the face-to-face value of that education component. So that was something that came up quite a bit, of a recognition that people are used to and kind of expect online options now, but there is that concern that losing the value of interacting directly with farmers and delivery staff. So with that, there's quite a mix right now of online only to online and in person, and some provinces still doing more of an in-person delivery model. So that's an interesting piece as well. And then the other piece in terms of delivery is the future of the EFP program must also include thoughtful consideration of how to balance being market-driven and educational, while also enabling access to cost share funding, which has traditionally been, the EFP has been used as an entry point for cost share programming for best management practices funding as well. And that brought us to another theme that came up quite a bit through the process, was the notion of incentives. So what does it take to encourage a farmer to actually participate in the EFP? And some of the comments we heard quite a bit was, if you want to see uptake, you need to think about incentives and incentive structures for producers. If you want it to be more of a market pull, you need to figure out how to reduce government red tape so the EFP programming can be delivered efficiently and effectively and evolve as the industry evolves. So some interesting comments from one of the participants. Another area where there's an evolution and transition happening is in that coverage and focus and content areas. So there's an opportunity to continue to evolve and diversify the EFP content. In some cases, we heard that the EFP books or content had not been updated for a few years. So there's definitely that need to kind of inject some funding and some time into, or an opportunity to inject funding and time into updating and creating a platform where things can be updated very on a nimble sort of way, and I'll use that word again later, I think. And then also we heard about the agricultural landscape's quite varied now, so how can we make sure we're bringing everyone along? So urban gardens and vertical agriculture, larger commercial operations, and niche products, beekeeping, maple syrup, anything along those lines. So there was some comments about making sure it's an inclusive, remains. I think it has consistently been a very inclusive program, but maintaining that inclusivity is important. And just as an example of some of the interesting coverage that we heard about from some of the participants, Manitoba is in the process of building in an online greenhouse gas emissions tool into their online EFP program, which will eventually allow farmers to estimate greenhouse gas emissions from their operations. So exactly what Colin was just mentioning is such an important thing to understand. Alberta has a habitat management assessment tool built into its online EFP program, where farmers can enter information about their farm habitat features. And then in return, they'll understand more about the potential species at risk that could inhabit their properties, and then stewardship opportunities and beneficial management practices to enhance habitat for each of those species. Prince Edward Island takes an interesting approach with by contracting out GIS mapping software services to pinpoint opportunities for farmers to address environmental risks based on the topography of their farm. So kind of a customized approach that we see there in PEI through the EFP. Great. And then the third area of transition that we heard about quite a bit through the process was that as the EFP program has evolved over time, so have the staff responsible for its oversight and delivery. And then with changes in staff, of course, there's always that risk of losing institutional knowledge on the history of the EFP program, and ensuring that that gets passed along while also kind of evolving into meeting the kind of modern needs of the agri-food industry as it evolves, and with the emerging trends and concerns and the need to adapt and mitigate for climate change. And we did hear quite a bit about cuts to extension programming from various spots across the country. There's generally a pretty strong theme that if we don't have those people in place to deliver some of the in-person components of the EFP to really amplify the educational importance of the EFP program, that could be a loss for the program. So that came up quite a bit as well. Right. So another thing we heard about quite often, and I think this is one of the important things to keep in mind with the environmental farm plan and how it's delivered across the country, is that regional diversity is really important. And we, in a country as large as Canada, with the variability in our agroclimatic conditions, topography, geography, kind of social norms even, it really doesn't work to employ a one-size-fits-all approach for education and beneficial management practices across the country. So having this regional, even though it's still within a province, and some of our provinces are quite large as well, there is that beneficial aspect of being able to really customize and tailor the EFP delivery and content that makes sense to the farmers within those provinces and regions. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. I know there's been some discussion of having one thing across Canada, but I think there is that real value in that regional specificity and letting that be reflected in the delivery and content of the program. With that in mind, however, we did hear quite a bit about the opportunity to communicate nationally, and there is a group of staff that do get together on call every couple of months. I believe they meet and discuss, kind of share things they're learning in that. So there is an opportunity to kind of balance that by honoring the regional specificity and also leveraging the EFP program collectively to tell the environmental sustainability story. And that would also could potentially lead to opportunities to collate data at a national level about on-farm environmental outcomes. And creating a national framework could also help to facilitate some efficiencies. For example, that habitat management tool in Alberta that could potentially be just copied in such a way as it could be shared across the provinces rather than each province having to create something from scratch. So how can we kind of inform some efficiencies and best practices through the EFP platform. Another piece we heard, and this goes back to a little bit on the transition of the content and the coverage and focus, is with the increasing need to meet the gas emissions and adapt, or reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to climate change. While we know there is a lot of good work underway across Canadian agriculture and agri-food sector, we're still in the position where we need to do more. We know that to meet the reductions plan even to 2030 will take quite a bit of work. And the EFP, while many of the books across the provinces do contain quite a bit of information that is related to climate change, it's not always specifically called out in its own standalone chapter, and that's maybe not the way to go anyway, but there is an opportunity to really increase the amount of coverage on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, mitigation, adaptation, those types of terms into the environmental farm plan. And again, using this word nimble to be able to add content as new science emerges, new practices that could be beneficial, or new tools to measure and collect data on climate change related practices would be a really great opportunity to explore further. And then we have the whole concept of the market-driven sustainability standards that are coming out, and some farmers are already having to face some of those sustainability standards and participate in them. And that varies quite a bit across the country at the moment and across commodities. So we won't get into that too much this morning, but it's a very interesting topic all on its own. So we are seeing those marketplace looking for those market data-driven indicators of sustainability at the farmland. Lots of global brands have their own, like Walmart has their own sustainability consortium piece, Unilever, those types of programs that we're seeing come forward. And so that is trickling down to farmers and being asked to participate in those programs. And I know Susie from our panel will talk a little bit more about these in her comments, I think, in the panel, and we'll get to in a few minutes. So some of the examples too are Dairy Farmers of Canada's Pro-Action program, which Julia in our panel will be talking more about. And then we have Sci Platform that's largely based out of Europe, but It's fairly popular with some of the big brands, like Coca-Cola, Unilever, Mars, Nestle. They have their farm sustainability assessment that some Canadian farmers, particularly I think Grain Farmers of Ontario is a member of that and has participated in some pilot projects there. And then we see some commodity specific sustainability standards as well, such as Chicken Farmers of Canada. The egg farmers have also released a NEST program. There's the wine growers have their own sustainability standards. So there's CRS, Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Beef, Canadian Roundtable Sustainable Crops. So we see quite a few different things happening in that sustainability standards. So trying to understand how the environmental farm plan can play a role. Can we leverage what's happening in the environmental farm plan to meet some of those sustainability standards? Or is the relationship different depending on what the market is demanding of that particular commodity? So all very interesting questions to discuss. So through our research, we came up with the following 5 recommendations for the environmental farm plan moving forward. So one would be to formalize the National Environmental Farm Plan Group through the creation of a National Environmental Farm Plan Alliance. So as I mentioned, the group of staff do often have calls, and Andy can tell us a little bit more about that in his comments in the panel. But to actually formalize and really recognize that that is a group, and there's real value in that sharing of best practices of the EFP across the country. The recommendation to core fund the EFP program, which could be a more challenging one to move forward, but it came up enough that we thought we should put it in there for a discussion point and see where we can go with that piece. And then also looking at integrating and leveraging the environmental sustainability programs and standards and content into the EFP program in such a way that we can kind of create that alignment with some of those market-driven sustainability standards. And the fourth one is somewhat related to the first one, is developing a national framework to harmonize EFP programming. It's a little bit different though, looking at ways not to make one plan across the country. As I mentioned, there is that value in regional diversity and specificity, but however, to see where we can actually harmonize some of the programming so that some of the data coming out of the provincial and territorial EFPs could be shared and could be consistent. So looking at some baseline things that could be developed to create a little more of a national picture of what's happening at the farm level from environmental sustainability practices. And then, of course, the fifth one, getting at that climate change adaptation and mitigation lens into the EFP programming. So in terms of next steps, we also saw 3 different pathways forward for the environmental farm plan program as we move into the consultations for the next policy framework. So there is always the status quo to maintain current program content development and delivery methods, as well as the current funding arrangements through the federal, provincial, territorial policy framework. And then the next one we wanted to kind of highlight was a reorientation of the EFP program, and looking at that as being more proactive regarding integrating EFP into market-driven sustainability standards. So how can we really start to focus on that kind of concept? And then the third pathway we saw was a revitalization of the education and risk management foundation of the EFP program. So that one might look more like amplifying the amount of extension staff that are available, the educational tools that are available through the EFP program, and how can there be connections with other federal and provincial programs such as Great Lakes, going to forget the acronym now, but some of the other programs around natural climate solutions and things like that. So how can you really use the EFP to get at some of those education and risk management aspects to get more beneficial management practices happening at the farm level across the country? And these pathways aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. There could be some combination of the 3 with a stronger focus on one or the other, or there could be maybe take 2 of them and really run with it, or take one and really go full on with one of the pathways. So we just thought it would be helpful to sort of present kind of different approaches towards the future of the pathways for the environmental farm plan program. Great. And just in closing, and we'll be moving to our panel in just a few minutes, but from our perspective on this, as we did the research for this policy paper, was that the future of the EFP program is bright. And through collaboration, the leveraging of longstanding program strengths and embracing new opportunities, the EFP program can continue to serve as the flagship agri-environmental program and educational tool for farmers across Canada. And I think I'll just stress there that education piece is really a critical one, that this EFP is perfectly situated as a educational tool if it can be used in that way. And in the process, the EFP program can be an important tool in the toolbox as farmers transition to new management practices as part of Canada's goal to be net zero by 2050. And with that, I would just like to thank my team, Dr. Andrea Gall and Krista Capitan, who worked on this paper and with me, and so that they did a great job. And thank you to Cappy as well for the opportunity to work on this paper. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And if there are questions or comments, we have a couple minutes built into the agenda before we turn to our panel. All right, so I see one question there from Dennis. Thanks, Dennis. Is there potential to develop one standard reporting format for all AFPs across Canada? If all EFPs generated the same report, it would be very useful from a market standpoint. Yes, that's a great question. Thank you, Dennis. That's where I was getting at with that fourth recommendation, is that national framework for the EFP programming across the country. And exactly that is trying to develop a set of baseline indicators or elements that would be collected in from each of the EFPs across the country, and to share that kind of nationally would be really valuable. And I agree, it would be valuable from that sustainability standpoint, as well as just consistency in terms of being able to tell the story about what's happening at the farm level across the country. So great question, thank you. And Crystal, do you think the national collaboration communications piece needs an organization or could be managed by an existing group? I think great question as well. I think the national collaboration, I don't think it needs a formal organization. That's why we call it an alliance. So more of a formalizing what's already happening. So as you'll hear from Andy in the panel, this group from the different EFPs across the provinces and territories already do communicate, but they might need a little bit more of a secretariat or something to help make that a little more effective and collaborative and a formal process that can be shared broadly and have some oversight. So yeah, there could be some value in looking at a collaboration with an existing group that could help form that collaboration. But yeah, I don't think we need to create a whole brand new organization, because agriculture is kind of bad for starting new organizations all the time. So thanks for that question, though. That'll be good for food for thought. I have a question from Brian Innes. Have you surveyed producers and asked about the value of the EFP and what contributes to it? We did not for this project. That's a great question. There has been work. We drew on some other reports that have been done that did do exactly that and surveyed producers. There's one from, I forget what year it was, but about 4 years ago that was conducted for the Ontario EFP, which has a pretty high uptake. And there were some from Alberta that had surveyed producers. So we did look at that through the desk research piece of the project. So we can talk about that as well. All right. Yeah, and Peter's comment looks like it's similar. Survey and research with those without an EFP, think about the program. Yeah, and I think we're going to get at that a little bit with our panel discussion. I think Susie has some comments on that, but that is definitely, so there's some comments that, yep, we'd like an answer to that question. So what we really need is a survey or research on what those with and without an EFP think about the program. Do I agree? Yes. So easy answer, yes, I agree. But the more complicated answer is getting at all those people with and without. So there are different ways we can do that, and different provinces have done that. And again, I comment that we did pull on some of that research for our desk research. So a great question from Darcy. What is the state of evidence or data regarding the extent that EFP have resulted in changed practices at the farm level? Do provinces have this data? Yeah, and I think I'll save that one for Andy to answer. So Andy, there's your heads up. It varies across the provinces. I'll start with that. It depends on how it's delivered and how they track what's happening at the farm level. So for example, in Nova Scotia, they have a direct farmer staff go to each farm and do the risk report with the farmer. And then when they go back to update the EFP, they will know which practices have changed. And then it varies from not knowing what's happening unless the farmer has access to cost share program, in which case there's more of a record keeping and validation that the actual cost share program was implemented as planned. So yeah, there's quite a bit of variability, but it's a great question. All right, yeah, another great one about market-driven sustainability standards typically require on-farm validation, whereas EFPs are currently focused on education and planning. Do you see EFPs integrating a verification process to meet market standards? Another excellent question, and Susie, I think I'll tap you to keep that one in mind for your comments, but yeah, that is one of the tricky spots at the moment, that on-farm verification is a critical part of most sustainability standards that are market-driven. And typically the EFPs have taken the other approach of a voluntary education trust kind of approach to the implementation of the EFP. So that is something that would have to be discussed and kind of looked at in terms of what would be relevant. One of the things that in another project I'm working on, we want to avoid is having farmers have to do multiple verifications and audits on their farms. So you have to be really thoughtful on how that goes forward. But yeah, excellent question. And we have another comment. I'm just aware of our time. We'll have time for, I'll read two more of these questions and then I'll move to our panel because I really want to bring them into the discussion because they'd be able to help me out with some of these answers. So yes, so we have a comment from Leanne, who is a cow-calf beef producer in southern Alberta, saying this is the first time she's heard of EFP. Definitely interested and we'll look at it going forward. A few questions. One, is there or will there be opportunities for financial incentives for carbon capture with respect to increasing soil organic matter? Great question. And two, how do EFPs work on a provincial scale with respect to municipality development? We try and operate with the environment at the forefront, but continuous growth within the MD seems to be counterproductive with respect to habitat, wildlife, groundwater. I love that question. That's a really interesting one about that relationship with the municipalities and the other pressures on agricultural land. So really important questions. So with respect to your first question, financial incentives for carbon capture, probably going to have to park that one for now. We'll see if we can get to it in the panel. That's a complicated question with lots of different answers to it, but hopefully one of my panelists will be able to help out with that one. And yeah, I don't think with municipalities, I don't think currently any of the EFPs really necessarily get into that relationship, but it's a really important one. So thank you for raising that. And just have one more question from Rob Gordon. Nice to see you online, Rob. What are your thoughts about ways to better improve applied research outcomes from example, agriculture, Agri-Food Canada and universities into EFP guidelines and actions? Yeah, that's a great question. We did ask our key informants that question of how much they interacted with their regional university, because it depends where they're located. And that varied quite a bit across the country, actually. In some provinces, there's quite a bit of interaction with experts. In other provinces, it was almost non-existent, that relationship. So I think there is an important opportunity there to increase that, especially if we think of the EFPs moving online. You could have some science-based evidence kind of moving more quickly into some modules and information and fact sheets related to beneficial management practices. So I think that is really important. And I was kind of surprised to see that in some provinces, there's almost no interaction with the regional relevant agricultural university, and others, they had almost a sign off on all of the EFP plans. So quite a bit of variety there. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. So thanks, Rob. Great. On that note, I think I'll close the question and answers for now. So I really want to bring in our panelists to the discussion. So if I could now have the screen shared with the panelist names, and we have 3 great people joining us today. So we have Andy Graham from the, just trying to pull up my bios, from the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, Susie Miller from the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, and Julia Buckingham from the Dairy Farmers of Canada. And just, I'll say your very brief bios because I think people want to get to the discussion. So Andy is the Executive Director of the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association and has been there with the OSCAA since 1990 and very involved with the delivery of the Ontario Environmental Farm Plan. We have Susie Miller, is the Executive Director of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops. And CRSC is a member-based organization that facilitates cross-commodity collaboration on sustainable agriculture issues and opportunities facing grain sector participants. And Susie has worked extensively with the Canadian agriculture and food industry with over 30 years of experience with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Government of Saskatchewan, and industry associations. And we also have Julia Buckingham with us today. She is the lead advisor on Dairy Farmers of Canada's sustainability strategy to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions from farm level dairy production by 2050. Prior to this, she oversaw the implementation of the environment module of ProAction, Dairy Farmer of Canada National Quality Assurance Program, which requires all dairy farms in Canada to complete an environmental farm plan or a plan d'accompagnement agro-environmental or equivalent in Quebec. And Julia holds a master's degree in sustainable food systems from the American University of Rome and is a certified sustainability consultant. So welcome to our panelists. Great to have all of you here today. And with that, I will turn things first to Andy just to give you a brief 2 to 3 minute introduction to yourself and a little bit of your connection to the EFP program.
Great. Thank you, Bronwynne, and hello, everyone. My arrival at Soil and Crop actually predated the EFP, so that gave me a unique opportunity to be working directly with the Ontario Farm Environmental Coalition at the time, as well as the provincial and federal partners in the early 90s on the initial creation of the Environmental Farm Plan in Ontario. And then, of course, assisted in the development of the delivery model here at Soil and Crop. As an adult education tool, it was modeled after the Farm Assist program that was operating in Wisconsin at the time. Soil and Crop has been the trusted delivery agent for EFP from the start here in Ontario, and we have a stellar team responsible for delivering the in-person workshops and supporting the online option. I should also mention we lean on the Provincial Ag Ministry for the technical content of the Environmental Farm Plan. EFP remains our most recognizable initiative since its introduction here in 1993. It has become a very prominent thread in the rural fabric, with tens of thousands of Ontario farm businesses voluntarily participating in one of, I think we're up to 3,800 workshops that have been held over the years. It's a major contributor to environmental improvements and has received considerable international recognition. And almost as exciting to the accomplishment here in Ontario in the early 90s was to see the excitement in EFP that was being expressed elsewhere in the country. Started with Atlantic Canada and then by Alberta a couple of years later. There have been many more engagements since all across Canada. I can certainly say the folks delivering EFP today are every bit as passionate as those who were involved decades ago. In about 2015, the Ontario farm groups, academics, food retailers, and processors got together to explore how EFPs could be transformed into sustainable farm and food plans. Those discussions recognized that such a plan would have to be national in scope to have the desired impact. And here we are. At the same time, in about 2015, the EFP practitioners from across Canada, Bronwynne made mention of that, We're exploring the idea of harmonizing provincial EFPs and benchmarking them against a globally recognized sustainability standard. The group, it was quite a highlight to see that the group made significant gains on this front with 2 summits that were held in Ottawa in 2016 and 2017. So who would have predicted after 29 years, the EFP, we would still be here and meeting today to chart a path for the future that promises to add even more to the long list of accomplishments. So there's a bit of an introduction on my experiences with EFP. Back to you, Bronwynne.
Great. Thank you, Andy. And I will turn now to Susie, if you could share a little bit about yourself and your relationship to the EFP.
Good morning. My involvement and the CRSC involvement pales in comparison with Andrew's foundational contribution. From a Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops perspective, we're very supportive of the utilization of the Environmental Farm Plan for grain farmers to be able to assess their risks and undertake action. We'll talk a little bit more later about this in the context of market demands, but definitely there are advantages to an environmental farm plan that do not exist in any other instrument in terms of its breadth, depth, and ability for a farmer to focus on their own land and their own operation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Susie. And Julia.
Thank you, Bronwynne. Well, I'm really happy to be here today with my cow. I got to represent the dairy industry here. So I've been working on the environment and sustainability file with DFC for a few years now. And as Bronwynne said, in my current role, I'm working on our national sustainability strategy to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions from farm level dairy production by 2050. And this is a goal that we confidently set and announced back in February of this year, based on the environmental achievements made to date in the dairy sector. Canadian dairy has one of the lowest carbon footprints per liter of milk in the world, and our farmers' commitment to continued progress. So that strategy builds on the environmental management practices that dairy farmers have been implementing for generations, as well as the environment module of ProAction, which is Dairy Farmers of Canada's National Quality Assurance Program. It's mandatory on all farms and includes 6 modules: milk quality, food safety, animal care, livestock traceability, biosecurity, and environment. So environment is the most recent module. It was introduced this past September, and it requires each farm to complete an environmental farm plan. In Quebec, farmers complete a PAA, which translates to an agri-environmental support plan, or its equivalent. Because the PAA is fee-based, we do offer a free version for dairy farmers in Quebec as part of the ProAction program that is really quite similar to the PAA. This program, the EFP PAA, was selected to form the foundation of the environment module based on its availability in every province. So we do have dairy farms in all 10 Canadian provinces, and we wanted to have a tool that would be consistent while also adapted to each region and to each individual farm and their environmental goals. So we informed farmers in 2016 that the EFP would become part of the ProAction program in 2021 to give ample time for everyone to complete their plan. And already in 2017, the Farm Management Survey by Statistics Canada showed that 81% of dairy farms had an EFP, which is the highest among agricultural sectors. So we see that farms really do see value in this program. And it's a really important tool for our industry, as it not only demonstrates our farmers' commitment to caring for the environment, but helps to propel it forward. So really looking forward to the discussion today.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia. And you started to touch on this, but I'll stay on you, Julia. If you could share a couple of things that you think are really valuable about the EFP program.
Yeah, so obviously there's lots that's really valuable about this program, but I will highlight 2 key areas, and those are awareness and action. So as Bronwynne noted, the educational aspect of the program is really one of its key benefits because the assessment that farmers undertake as part of the development of their EFP covers such a wide range of topics and helps farmers to take note not only of areas of potential environmental risk and concern, but also areas of strength. And noting strong points is really important because it helps build momentum to take action on those areas that might need more attention. Which leads into my second point, which is that the EFP encourages action. So every farm develops its own personalized action plan based on the assessment, which is important for sustainability because we know that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. And so the way that the program is set up allows each farm to address their own risks and opportunities in a way that works for their operation.
Excellent. Yeah, I really like that. Susie, I'll go to you next. A couple of things that you think are valuable about the EFP program.
There are many things that are valuable, but I would start off by saying that the EFP practices are based on science and on science as relative to Canada. And that's really important because from a grains industry perspective, there are, the standards are, for the most part, developed internationally and in response to situations that are occurring in other parts of the world in the grain sector. So that's number one, science-based. Number two is flexibility. And Bronwynne, you mentioned about the flexibility that's inherent between the regions. But what we heard from grain farmers when we talked to them about a national code of practice is it must be flexible farm to farm to farm. And that, you know, every farm is got a different crop mix, it's got different landscape features, different history, and having an EFP that a program that is able to provide the best advice and the best tool for risk assessment and practices that can apply to across the variation in farms is extremely valuable. Thank you.
Excellent. Great, thank you. And that kind of gets back to Rob's question about science-based. So I like that integration there. And Andy.
Yeah, a couple of things, perhaps building on some of the comments that have already been made. First, the workbooks across the country reflect regional variation, priorities, and delivery methods. Bronwynne, you mentioned that in your summary. We were part of a study that was conducted in 2015 by a consulting group called Spearheading, and they concluded the essential content alignment across the 10 provincial EFP workbooks was remarkably good. There's always concern that we're going in too many different directions and touching on too many, a long list of environmental issues. But it was reassuring to get their report that there was a tremendous alignment, which of course contributes that we do have the opportunity to move to a national framework to harmonize and strengthen the programming if that's a desired wish. The other thing I would say about EFP is we have been invested in all provinces to keep it relevant. The information in the EFP has evolved as new environmental issues have been recognized. The initial focus was erosion control, surface and groundwater protection. It now encompasses soil health, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing carbon sequestration, and biodiversity. We can do more, but the foundation piece has already been mentioned. And all through that evolution here in Ontario, lasting 29 years, it has continued to successfully support a broad suite of incentive programming. So I think that is a tremendous strength of the program. Bronwynne.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. And I think we've had some questions in the chat and we're going to go to those in a few minutes, but this next question I'm going to ask kind of relates to some of the things people are asking about outcomes, validation of what's happening, the change level. So Andy, I'll start with you. Do you think the EFP in its current format adequately supports change at the farm level, and why or why not? And how do we know? Maybe I'll add a little twist too.
Yeah, a terrific question. Certainly, we are strong proponents that self-directed adult learning is the most effective tool to instigate positive change. I can provide a couple of examples. A study was undertaken in Ontario in 2010 by Prairie Research Associates that evaluated the level of implementation of the EFP action plans in Ontario. It included a confidential survey of 189 farmers with EFPs and revealed high levels of implementation and significant investment in time and money to reduce environmental risks and improve environmental conditions. Farmers, the report summarized, farmers completed or were implementing over 2/3 of the actions that had identified in their action plans and invested an average of $70,000 per farm, with about 3/4 of that figure coming out of their own back pocket. Along with that, they were spending an average of 130 hours of their time per farm implementing those changes. So that does provide some pretty reliable measures as to the motivational value of the environmental farm plan. It's a learning tool, it's an awareness tool, but it's also a motivating tool. The other item, as evidence, through a variety of programs in our shop here in Ontario, we've administered incentive payments estimated at more than $250 million over the years, resulting in a total investment of over $460 million of on-farm environmental improvements. Those are the projects that have been supported. That figure does not include, going back to the PRA study, all the work that's being done outside of the cost share programs. That's the difficult ones to get our thumb on. There was a comment earlier, have we been surveying non-participants? That's a much tougher nut to crack than surveying participants. And we haven't done as much as we hope to have been able to do with non-farm participants.
Great. Or farmers who have not participated in the EFP. Yeah, exactly. No, that's really interesting. And so that study is 2010. So it kind of begs the question of, should this be an ongoing type of study that happens across the country, of going back into those evaluation kind of modes to understand what's really happening at the farm level. So interesting. Thank you for that. And Julia, I think I'll ask if you have some comments on that if the EFP in its current format adequately supports change at the farm level, and how do we know those types of things?
Yeah, so I really like what Andrew said. I think that awareness piece is so important, because there are going to be a lot of farmers that are environmentally minded and have been, doing research and looking into this for many years. But for a lot of farmers, doing the EFP can really be an eye-opening process. And so by going through each of those different sections on their farm and in the plan, and looking through and building that awareness and seeing where there might be some easy things that they can implement, I think that will encourage change, whether it's immediately or down the road. Going through the process of that helps farms to really open up to what the potential is. And so I think another aspect that's important is the fact that completing an EFP helps farmers to be eligible for funding in a lot of different provinces. So this can help them to access best management practices, technical resources, and things like that. So, and especially for us as DFC, now that we're moving towards this sustainability strategy and reaching net zero by 2050, the fact that our farms have this awareness of their environmental picture really helps them to know what practices are going to be the best to implement for them when it comes to that.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia. And we're going to shift gears a little bit now to get at some of the ideas around the relationship between sustainability standards and the EFP. And I'm going to turn things over to Susie to answer this question, that if the EFP is going to support market-driven sustainability standards, what factors need to be considered? What do we need to think about to make that happen? or
Thank you,
should it
Bronwynne.
happen?
Well, I'm going to relate some of the feedback we got from farmers. The CRSC has been looking at developing a code of practice that could be utilized as a marketing tool and public trust tool across the country, a national one. And we talked a lot about what is it that is, what kind of tool are going to be those that are both helpful for the marketplace and that farmers will adopt. And in terms of the marketplace, this was suggested frequently by farmers, but then they said, well, I don't have one and my neighbor doesn't have one. And from a grains industry perspective, overall, the numbers are quite low relative to dairy, and regionally they vary. So, for example, you'll have high uptake in grain farmers in Ontario and much less so in Saskatchewan, for example. So as a tool that we could use for marketing immediately, it was more sort of in the future. So it needs to be more, the uptake needs to be much higher in order to be able to utilize it effectively as a marketing tool. But that's not to say that the work isn't valuable. For example, in our code of practice, we're looking at saying, okay, what is the relationship between the two? And if we do develop and get accepted a code of practice, if somebody does have a relevant environmental farm plan, then it can be accepted. And also industry practices that we support, such as the 4R nutrient program, that has been integrated into some of the EFPs across the country. So I think that there's a lot of capacity to utilize, to leverage the EFP, but as a marketing tool, it's not quite ready. So it needs kind of universal or more widespread adoption. And the second part is that it needs to be current. Farmers told us, yes, we had one, but it kind of sits on the shelf. And it's not a living document in the same way among the farmers we talked to, as Julia and Andrew have indicated. So there is quite significant variability on how those environmental farm plans are used across the country. So if it's more frequently updated, a living document, I think that that would be very helpful as well.
Thank you. Julia, just quickly, do you want to comment on that current aspect of the EFP? What is the expectation for ProAction? Is that within 2 years? Is that correct? Or?
So we follow the expiry periods that are dictated by the provinces.
Right.
So I think about half of the provinces, it's about 5 years, and then some give 7 or 10. So we follow what the provincial recommendation is.
Right. So that's another important consideration then if we're looking at how things could be consistent across the country, if that kind of currency of the EFP and how frequently a farmer would have to update their own EFP would be another interesting thing to have to look at. So thanks for bringing that up, Susie, and thanks, Julia. Yeah, great comments. And Andy, did you want to add anything to that in terms of that relationship between EFP and sustainability standards? And Julia, for sure, if you want to jump in after Andy, that'd be great too.
Well, I think the folks on the call here that are familiar with the EFP will know that it's a true risk management assessment and not a checkbox exercise. With EFP, the practices are ranked in Ontario across 380 questions, 23 worksheets, 1 being the highest potential to negatively affect the environment, or 4 being the best situation. Now, in some provinces, that scale is reversed, but that's okay. Our investigations into SI Platform's farm sustainability assessment as one example of a global sustainability benchmarking tool. It's about 112 yes/no questions. So right away, we've got a challenge. How do we make those two types of responses communicate with one another in a meaningful way. Some provinces have successfully reformatted their EFP to align better with the farm sustainability assessment, but the reconciliation can be complex. We haven't made it there in Ontario yet, but other provinces in the West have. If leveraging the time already invested by the farmer in EFP is desired, we'll need to find a way for these two products to communicate with one another, whether it's side platforms or some other form of program. And there were comments made about data. Governments have been truly respectful of the need to keep personal data from EFPs private and confidential. That's been a principle from day one with the program. Confidentiality has been paramount to our success over all these years. However, I think we all agree it's difficult to measure performance to satisfy market-driven sustainability initiatives in the absence of critical data that has been consistently gathered, which was another point that was made earlier in the discussion. Some provinces have found success in leaving the verification exercise up to the sector. That has merit to it, rather than, say, for us as a delivery agent to get into verification, to leave it up to the Dairy Farmers of Canada, for example, to do their own verification. There's a good argument that that's a pretty neat fit, but different experiences in other provinces so far.
Great, thank you. And Julie, I just want to come back to you in terms of in Dairy for Action's case, it's mandatory, the participation, and Susie has mentioned that the grain farmers, it was seen as the uptake wasn't quite high enough. Could you talk a little bit about any, and this question I didn't warn you about, so any kind of reaction from farmers on that mandatory component? I know you gave the DFC gave 4 years of warning, kind of a heads up, this is coming down the pipe, but can you have any reaction to that? And now that it is a thing, how's it going?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there's a wide range of reactions to the environmental farm plan. Like I said, there are a large number of farms that already had environmental farm plans before it became a requirement. And so farmers saw value in doing this exercise and in the funding programs that were available as a result. But of course, there are some farms for whom, like, going through this process, it does take time. It requires time resources, financial resources. Depending on the province, farms might have to take a couple of days off to go attend a workshop, or they might need to sit down at their computer for a long time to fill out the assessment online. And so it is a significant investment, which is why I think the change piece, we can associate them that they've taken the time to go through this process, that we really hope and expect that there would be some positive change that would come as a result. But I think one of the challenges that we discussed we had an environment working group that was developing the environment module of ProAction, is the confidentiality aspect of these plans. They are designed as awareness and educational and learning tools. And so we didn't want to take away from that aspect of the going through and like doing the verification and the validation of every single portion of the assessment. And so what we ask farmers to do is to complete the assessment. And then during the ProAction validation, we have a couple of other requirements that we ask about. So things like manure storage, wastewater, manure management, so that we know what's happening with those big areas of risk. But then we leave it up to the individual farms to take the actions that are best suited to their operation. So that's the path that we have taken.
Excellent. Thank you for adding that additional context. It's really interesting. Super. So we're going to get to the audience questions. I know I keep promising that, but we have one more question I want to get to. And Susie, I'll open it up with you to talk about those incentive pieces. So we've heard about the EFP, that some people participate because they want to participate in a cost share program of some sort. And just if you had some comments on what would make the EFP more enticing for farmers to complete across Canada.
Well, it's not just the EFP, it's any kind of environmental sustainability documentation, change, reporting, etc. What they have told us is that it needs to help their bottom line. And their bottom line is not necessarily, a cost shared purchase of a particular piece of equipment. It's ongoing in order to have it effective. So it needs to be related to their financial viability and also their position in the marketplace. It's a huge challenge to be able to do that, but that's what they told us.
Oh, great. Andy or Julia? Andy, I'll start with you. Do you want to add anything to that?
It's an interesting question. And when Ontario's greatest period of growth with EFP participation was in the first dozen years after we rolled it out. And during that time, we had more than 25,000 workshop participants. And yet the incentive available was $1,500 over those 12 years. Things changed very significantly in 2005 with the introduction of the first ag policy framework that supported EFP activity. The cost share went from that $1,500 to $30,000 per farm business. Plus, because of associated programs that we were delivering and the ability to stack that money, it moved pretty quickly to $90,000 per farm business. And it was a game changer because people were no longer coming to the workshops as they had in the first 12 years for the education. They were seeing EFP as a gateway to cost share. And we're still in that world. We can hope to go back to the day that it was purely an educational pursuit. But I think further to the earlier comments on remaining relevant, we've got to recognize the needs of farmers, and the points that Susie were making are very, very relevant. There's got to be recognized return on investment. Now, there's a lot of ways we can structure the incentives to hit that mark, and we can talk about that if you like, but maybe back to you for now.
Great, thank you. And I think that segues nicely to a comment really from one of the audience members that if everyone has an EFP, they fail to see how it becomes a marketing tool, as there would be limited to no potential for a price premium in products. So that brings in the idea that sustainability or environmental management could somehow be translated to a price premium at the retail or through the supply chain. So I wonder if, Susie, do you want to start with that one in terms of that?
Absolutely. And our assessment and our research work that was done last fall with marketers and purchasers have, sort of customers of grain farmers, is that the sustainability value proposition is less about individual premium on the product sold, and it's more table stakes for participation. And they do see a benefit based on Canada's ability to leverage its brand and to access premium markets, but it is a requirement like food safety that is part of what customers define as the quality that they want when they purchase a product. So I think it's naive. There are certainly certain circumstances, and also farmers want to see the benefits evenly spread across the supply chain. But I think it's naive to think that everything we do to either establish that we have good sustainability practices or improve sustainability practices will be rewarded. It doesn't seem to be there.
Interesting, thank you. Julia, did you want to comment on that from dairy farmers' perspective, or?
I'll pass it on to Andrew for this one.
Pass on. Over to you, Andy. And you're still on mute, Andy.
That's because I'm thinking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Bought yourself some time.
Will there ever be enough dollars? The more interest we drum up in EFP and the related cost share, there never seems to be enough dollars. But there's many things we've tried here, and other provinces have tried to better direct those limited dollars to the projects that provide the greatest benefit, whether that benefit is on farm or off farm to the rest of society. The point about return on investment, that maybe once a best management practices proves to provide favorable return to the farmer, maybe that's an indication for government to throttle back or perhaps eliminate that best management practices altogether from the list of eligible products. Just as EFP needs to remain relevant, the list of supported BMPs also needs to be revisited frequently. Another type of incentive that came up in some of those discussions we have nationally with EFP practitioners, I think it was PEI, they provide a break on the crop insurance for those who can demonstrate they have an environmental farm plan. So it's a different way of putting money in your pocket, but it's a great example of working with the private sector and quasi-government sector to look at other ways EFP can be used to return in a viable way to the producers who are taking part.
Yeah, that's. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a question from the audience that ties to this, and I also want to touch on that financial piece, because I've heard recently that some banks are looking at having some evidence of sustainability to help with loans and things. So there's some really interesting things happening on the environmental and social governance aspect from a financial component as well. The question from the audience is, are there non-environmental incentives that have been promoted to farmers, like saving money on fuel or access to certain markets? And Susie, I wonder if you could comment on that first. Does that ever come up in your discussions?
If you take a look at the greatest contribution that grain farmers have made in the last 30 years to climate change mitigation, and it has been the adoption of conservation tillage. And from my recollection, and having spent 12 years of that time in Saskatchewan, there was limited to no federal government support. And on the provincial side, it was investment into the technology, if there was any. But it was done because it made sense. And it made sense because it increased the yields, it allowed the capacity to use more land by not summer fallowing. It had a significant impact on their viability. And I think that's one of the things that, to me, is the greatest tool. And we don't spend a lot of time on that. You know, we did an assessment, two literature reviews about 2 years ago. One looked at the on-farm benefits to grain farmers of biodiversity, and the second looked at consequential life cycle assessments. So what actions taken would reduce greenhouse gas emissions or change? We couldn't find any research. We spend a lot of time researching best practices, but not necessarily the economics of it. And that's a missing piece. So if those best practices in an EFP are accompanied by, you know, this is how it can reduce your fuel consumption or reduce your fertilizer use, like, you know, the 4R does, I think that would be exceedingly helpful to expand the capacity of the EFP program to be more relevant to more farmers.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here because I hit those three kind of areas. We see the evolution in EFP with the delivery, content, and then staff. And this question is more about staff from an audience. Is a study on the EFP published in 2021 in Ontario that conducted on-farm surveys demonstrated that the advisory services and staff engaged in supporting farmers did not have sufficient knowledge to help farmers implement environmental actions. So I'm not sure what study this refers to, but the question is an interesting one, though, is do you consider training of trainers as a potential tool to support EFP? And I think that's a really interesting model that's used in various places, but Andy, I might put you on the hot seat there to see if you want to answer. Is training of trainers ever come up as a potential tool to support EFP or that staffing component?
Absolutely. And there's some good examples of that in a couple of the recent programs that we've been delivered where we engage soil and crop. Just to be clear, we are not technical experts. We are workshop facilitators and coordinators. I mentioned earlier that we lean on the Ministry of Agriculture to provide the technical content of the workbook. But with a lot of changes in how extension is done in Ontario over the life of the environmental farm plan here, we've had to look at other innovative ways of providing that technical content. A recent study we did into the barriers of farmers adopting cover crops and soil testing revealed the top 3 barriers were finances. We've been talking about that. It was the amount of paperwork, a criticism that is tough to avoid in applying to these programs. And third, the provision of one-on-one technical assistance. What we did in a pilot project, which the final report was just submitted, and it's perhaps the one that's being referred to here, is we leaned on an industry advisory team to try and come up with some creative ways of overcoming this. And something we did that proved to be very, very successful is the moment a producer applied to the program, he or she was immediately linked up with a certified crop advisor, whether they came with their own name or, and if they didn't, one was assigned to them. And that CCA was as a requirement of the program, and of course they were very willing to engage, sat down with the individual to talk about their particular situation and provided terrific recommendations on where the greatest success would likely be realized. It was very, very well received by the producers in the program. We've done something similar with the Farmland Health Checkup, which is several years old now and available to farmers in the Lake Erie Basin, where again, we aligned participating farm businesses with certified crop advisors or professional agrologists to sit down and review their farm. It was a complement to the EFP, not a replacement.
Great. Yeah, really interesting piece there. And I'm realizing we are almost out of time. So I'm trying to find the last gem of a question. There are so many great questions. And I will make a comment that we will capture all of these. They'll be kept and we'll be able to make sure that we either reach back out or incorporate these into some edits to the final report. So we'll hopefully capture all of that. So I apologize in advance that we won't be able to have time to get to all of the questions. But I have one that I think is interesting here. The Canadian soybean industry is on a path to implement a verified sustainability program with the EFP and SCI platform. Very interesting complementary options. What would it take to have the EFP implemented in the next policy framework, both in terms of infrastructure and also funding to encourage grower adoption? So we've talked a little bit about that, but Susie, do you want to comment on that?
Well, in terms of what I'm interpreting Brian's question is that will there continue to be an EFP within the context of the next policy framework? And I will make a prediction that definitely yes, there has been much more emphasis, on from the federal government and provincial governments on the farm contribution to climate change mitigation and environmental solutions. So I would expect that, in fact, there are going to be increased emphasis on all of the tools. And this integration is something that I think that as industry, we need to work with our provincial colleagues on an ongoing basis. So I would encourage, in terms of your recommendation, that that network become more than just the deliverers and the funders, but the users. And so we did have the National Environmental Farm Plan initiative several years ago, and we had some really good discussions. But I think industry needs to be part of it, and then we can get to, the solutions that Brian is talking about, because we want to use it for marketing purposes.
Great. Thank you. Any last comments from you, Julia, on any of the questions you're seeing, or anything you want to add from your participation from the dairy farmers?
Yeah, I just want to echo Susie's comments that I think that there's momentum for the environmental farm plan, and I think there's a lot of interest from industry, from farmers, from all of the different stakeholders to really see this kind of program be harmonized and even further utilized. So yeah, there's just a lot of interest in that from our industry as well.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Julia. And with that, I think I'll thank all of the panelists, and thank you, Susie, Andy, and Julia. I think your insights were really helpful today and really informative for the discussion. So I appreciate all your time spending the day with us. And on that note, I will turn things back over to Tyler McCann from CAPI.
Thank you, Bronwynne. And again, thank you to the panelists. I think that the discussion today underscores how the environmental farm plan's been a tool that has been available, that's been used. It underscores the long-standing commitment that producers across this country have made to improving environmental performance, but has also highlighted the increased pressures that exist and the need to make sure that our tools that our farmers are using to continually improve their environmental performance continue to improve themselves as well. We look forward to releasing the report that Bronwynne and her team have worked on, and again, I think that it will be something that will help further on this debate and this dialogue that's happening in the context of the next policy framework and the changes that are coming down the pipe. CAPI has a webinar coming up on the 18th of May that will highlight the work that our doctoral fellows have done. They have a final report that will be released this month on how we translate science to policy and what approaches can be taken to improve carbon sequestration in Canadian soils and croplands. Once again, we'd like to acknowledge the support of the RBC Foundation for CAPI's environmental program, of which this project is one component of. And again, we thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great day.